Good morning, CHD. Welcome to Pediatric Perspectives, where we are looking at children's health challenges from a different perspective, one that includes critical thinking, one that's not afraid to give you the honest truth. My guest today is Suzanne Humphries. Suzanne, it's so great to have you back on the show.
Thanks, Paul. This is one of my favorite shows, actually. I rarely get to speak to pediatricians. So, yeah, I really enjoyed our last one.
Well, you are like an honorary pediatrician with lots of exclamation marks because of your incredible work. You're board certified, or were board certified, in internal medicine and nephrology. You wrote Dissolving Illusions, one of the few books I think everyone on the planet must own if you want to understand the history of vaccines. You just came out with your 10th anniversary edition, which has a whole second volume with all the references. So masterpiece reference work. Thank you so much for all that work.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, and let's just set the record straight here right now, because the trolls love to say that I'm not board certified. Okay, so I did let go of my nephrology board certification in 2017 because I don't use it, because I don't practice nephrology anymore. And then I went back, and let's say, who does this? Who goes back after 20 years and recertifies in internal medicine?
Who does that? You did that?
I went back and recertified in internal medicine and
Wow.
did like way better the second time than the first time. I was in the top 95 percentile, trolls. Okay, so there's that, because after being on the Joe Rogan show, they're out there saying that I'm not even board certified.
My Lord.
Like, it's easy enough. You just go to my webpage and you can see my internal medicine board certification. So
Wow.
Anyway, whatever.
Wow. For viewers who don't know this, you're not getting paid to do this interview. You have not been paid to do most of the work that you've chosen to do out of, actually, let's start there. You were mainstream medicine, and we've shared this before, but there's new people on who may not know your story. What triggered your departure from mainstream medicine? Just sort of the quick overview.
What triggered my departure is what strikes fear in the bones of those that want to maintain the status quo, because once you see a problem as big as the vaccination issue, then you start just asking a whole bunch of questions around that. And I liken that to a little chip on your windshield of your car, and it sits there for a while and it starts to spread, and it's going to spread. And then the whole thing potentially can crumble if somebody just touches it. So what happened with me is I was, I just, early on in my career, I just kept going deeper and deeper into the system and into internal medicine. And the reason I did is because I started out as just a regular general internist, and I didn't feel like I really had a good enough grasp on everything because things have become so complicated within the conventional medical views, I guess you could say, because we have all these subspecialties, and then it's not like the old days where you're a GP and you could still be a GP, but I frankly think that GPs have to be the smartest people on planet Earth, because I don't know how they manage everything the way they do.
I felt the same way, actually, when I was in medical school and I was picking specialties. My dream was to be a GP, and I'm going, I can't handle all this. How do they do that?
Pretty much have to have a grip on all the subspecialties in order to even, know where to go.
Right.
And so, yeah, my hat's off to them. But I felt like I had a real lack of understanding of critical care medicine. So, and I really loved kidneys. I loved my rotation through nephrology. And nobody else seemed to love it. So nobody wanted to do it. So I thought, well, that's a good place to go, because there's kind of a bit of a vacuum there. At least there was at the time. And I liked it. And so I applied for a nephrology fellowship, and I went and did that. And I'm really glad I did that, because those extra 2 years really gave me clarity and confidence that I had a better grasp on the situation. And then, because that's just how I am, is I like to keep solidifying what I know, is that I went into academia for 2 years. And then, the pay is so low. And again, hats off to people in academia. I can see why they want to start selling supplements, doing other things, because there just is no money in academia. And I couldn't pay my loans off. That was really the problem. So I left academia in Philadelphia and then Camden, New Jersey, and I went up to Maine. And I stayed there for 10 years practicing conventional nephrology. I was 100% consultative nephrology. And I was still teaching. I was still teaching medical residents at the institution where I was up in Bangor, Maine. And I was making lots of money and I was really happy. I had this beautiful house. I really felt like I had kind of this idyllic life. I was like pretty much happy to get up in the morning and go to work. I actually loved doing the dialysis. I loved my dialysis patients, and I would still do that if that was an option for me. But I just felt that it wasn't after a while. I watched the corporate system take over our independent dialysis units, and nothing good, I don't really believe, except financially, maybe for the hospital, really came of that. I saw them firing lots of nurses that I really loved. And I don't think the patients were very happy about it, but that's how you conserve money when you're putting out so much for these people's lives over a long period of time. And I'm not an administrator, so I can't speak to that. But before I left in 2011, and sometime in 2008 or 2009, it's kind of become a little bit shadowy now, but I have a video that I did called Honesty versus Policy, where I detail every painful incident that happened with all the evidence and proof and documentation. And that's on my Odyssey channel. I had a few things happen to me. I had a friend who had children that were never vaccinated. And that was a concept that was foreign to me. I never heard of not vaccinating your children. And
Right.
I got vaccinated before medical school. Flu vaccines were a part of life, even though I refused them because I'm an instinctive person, and instinctively, I didn't want it. And then I agreed to have a vaccine in my 4th year of medical school during my emergency rotation. And man, that I got sicker than I've ever been in my life. And I even back then I was like, well, that's really weird. I got the flu shot like a few weeks ago, and now I'm sicker than I've ever been. And of course, everybody told me I was crazy. And I thought, well, maybe it's not related. And I put it to sleep and went back to work. And then they chased me around trying to give me an updated measles shot up in Maine. And I was like, why did they want to give me a measles shot so badly? And I just thought, common sense. Why don't we check my blood and see what my titers are? Well, sure enough, my titers were, off the chart, because I'm vaccinated, and vaccinated people tend to get really high antibody titers, which is the gold standard for testing whether you're immune or not, which is
especially that vaccine. I was checking all my patients' titers for measles, mumps, rubella, trying to avoid a booster. And it was amazing how many people were above the maximum testable limit. It was like, wow, what is going on with this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so effective, don't you know, Paul? So effective. It's so effective that everyone has to have it, because if measles creeps in, even the vaccinated will catch it. So we all got to do it. Same old story. So I had the friend with non-vaccinated children. And I remember one day watching one of her kids play with a hammer and nails. And I said to her, you better be careful, because she's not vaccinated and she could get tetanus. And she said, what do you know about tetanus? And in my head, I thought, I don't know anything about tetanus. And outside I said, I know you don't want to get it, and I know it can cause lockjaw, and you don't want that. And I'm in that very moment, I decided to make it a mission to go learn something about tetanus, because I realized my conscience told me that there was a little bit of a vacuum there. So I went and did that. And in the meantime, I watched those kids be like ridiculously healthy. And it wasn't because of either their parents, because their parents were not good genetic stock. Okay. And then I saw the school that they went to was a Steiner school, which back in that time, there were a lot of not vaccinated kids there. I think since then, Steiner's been a bit infiltrated, the Steiner system. But anyway, a lot of those kids were just like really bright. Their parents would say they've never been, this was a new concept to me, never been on antibiotics. So I thought, all right, well, I should probably pay attention to this, because this is a health anomaly to me. So I did. I paid attention, and I watched them over years, and I saw that if they got sick, they would just have a fever and burn it out in about 24 hours, and that would be the end of it. I saw them have whooping cough. I saw them have chicken pox. Okay, so that's in the background. And then one day in 2009, I go into work after having the weekend off, and there's a guy on dialysis. And I thought he was a visitor, because we get a lot of visitors through Maine. And they just kind of come to our dialysis unit while the time they're on holiday. And I'm getting a history on him, saying, how long have you been on dialysis? And he's like, I've never been on dialysis. And he said it like so pressured, like he had been trying to tell people and no one was listening to him, like one of those bad dreams. And so I thought, all right. Well, what happened? And he said, I was fine till I had that shot. And I looked, and sure enough, his kidney function about a month before the shot was perfectly normal, had been normal in the past. And then all of a sudden he's on dialysis. So I thought, okay, well, that's
Wow.
interesting. And I looked up, can flu shots cause kidney failure? And sure enough, you see enough of it in the medical literature. And then, of course, I was I was doubted every step of the way if I would bring it up. And I was told to do my own research, because then there became a series of these cases. I started taking a vaccine history that winter. Another thing that people don't do with adults, I'm told, by my critics, oh, it's always done with children. Well, trust me, it's not always done with
No,
adults.
it's not.
Yeah, especially in the inpatient setting, it's not done. So I started doing it in the inpatient setting. Oh my gosh, the correlations were just really ridiculous that I saw there. So I thought, all right, well, that's interesting. And then, okay, tick number 3, I admitted a patient to the hospital because we used to do our own biopsy admissions. It was an older woman who had a protein-losing nephropathy, pretty serious. I tried to manage it medically and I couldn't, and I really needed to see what was going on inside of her kidney and her glomerulus. So I get up to the floor after my day of working in the office to do the admission, and I pick up the chart and I see that 2 vaccines had been given. The seasonal influenza and then the H1N1 were given to her. And I thought, oh, I must have the wrong chart. So I look again and nope, that's her name. And then I look again and I see that my name is as the signing physician to give the vaccine. And at that point, I started to boil internally. And I had a discussion with the nurse who said, oh no, this is what we do now. The pharmacist comes by as soon as the patient's admitted. Of course, they go in as fast as they can before the doctor gets there. And they give them a little piece of pink paper that gives them some propaganda. And if the patient agrees, they are given the shot. Yeah. And so that's where I really said, okay, now I just can't sit back and watch this. So I did some research, and I wrote a white paper, and that paper is now on my website, drsuzanne.net.
So, Dr. Humphries, we have the same thing happening in newborns and children, and this has been going on for about the same duration. It's been a decade at least, where I would go into the hospital to do a newborn check, and they had already gotten the Hep B vaccine, and I didn't order it. And in fact, I was unable at this main hospital that I was practicing at to get that changed. I could not get the standing order changed. They just wouldn't do it. So the only way I could prevent newborns from getting that shot when they didn't need it, which was most newborns, well, every single newborn in my practice, there wasn't a one that mom had Hep B. So the only way was to educate the parents ahead of time. And I didn't always have the ability to do that. But so this has been happening for a while. The system was set up to just push vaccines into people, whether or not they needed them.
Yeah, it's just horrid what happens with the infants. And then they have the crash carts and the caffeine resuscitation waiting by, don't they?
In the NICU, they absolutely do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And same with dialysis patients, although they're much older, obviously. But we found that we would give them several series of 4 shots and they were still not responding. But it doesn't look, you can't make sense of a lot of this. Yeah. Anyway, so I sent my letter to all these CEOs of the hospital, and I heard nothing back. And then I had a few conversations. I'm just going to make a long story short. I had a few conversations with the chief of medicine, who was previously very friendly to me and became progressively more unfriendly to me. Even though all I was asking was that they would hold off vaccinating until the day of discharge when everything was stable. They couldn't see the problem with giving a vaccine to somebody, I walked into a room of a guy in his 20s who was actively getting chemotherapy for leukemia. And I was consulted for kidney failure, and they vaccinated him before I got there too. Wow. It just didn't matter. There's no unsafe time to give a vaccine, apparently. So that's how it all started for me. And after a while, I could have stayed in there if I had like the tenacity of some people, but I didn't. I just felt like, okay, I have something here that's seems really relevant. I need to learn more about it. And I'm going to bring the message directly to the public, because going through doing my own research, as they suggested, they'll tie me up for years, and then they'll say that it's just case reports and it's done by an anti-vaxxer or whatever. Yeah, I knew their game already, so I just really didn't want to play their game, and I've never played their game.
So you walked away from a very lucrative practice.
Yeah.
Into the world of how did you support yourself? How did you survive?
Yeah, so I went from having $300,000 a year, but I was able to pay my loans off, and that's about it. I paid my loans off. I hadn't paid my mortgage off, but I did. So I was able to get out of the mortgage and break even.
Okay.
And I didn't want to go into debt because I didn't know where things were going to go. So I went and I lived with my sister for a while, and then I went and lived on a farm in Virginia at a friend's farm with the horses. And I pitched a tent in the back of the farm, and that's where I lived. And I pitched two tents. One of them was a pop-up camper. That's where I slept. There's not a lot of, if you've ever been in a pop-up camper, you really don't live in a pop-up camper.
No,
You basically,
I had one for some
yeah,
time. Yes.
right. So
With a
one
whole
end of
bunch
it is
kids.
for storage, and the other end is for sleeping, and the middle is it's a disaster. And then so I got the biggest tent I could get from REI. It was like a 10-person tent, and I got a really nice chair and kind of a rickety old desk, and I set that up, and that was my office. And me and about 5,000 daddy long legs lived in that tent, because what I found later is that apparently they're attracted to the color orange. And so every time I would have to have a brush outside to get into the tent to get rid of like the millions of not the millions, but hundreds of daddy long legs that were just hanging on to it, because I just didn't want them inside with me and have a phobia of them or anything. But if you did have arachnophobia, you wouldn't have wanted to be me back then. So that was the middle of writing Dissolving Illusions. And so I pretty much had my time free. I was not in debt. And I think I might have been doing a little bit of maybe online consultation here and there, which actually was enough to kind of buy food. And I never skimmed on my food. I always ate healthy, but I wasn't spending any money. And so I did that for probably like a year and a half. And then the Scandinavians were interested in what I had to say. So they invited me to Scandinavia, and I went to, I think it was 3 years in a row I went there. And at the last year I went, I think I hit pretty much all the Scandinavian countries plus Finland, which actually is not a Scandinavian country, I found out later, but all the other ones, including Iceland, and that was really cool. So that's kind of how this all started. And so Dissolving Illusions came out in 2013, and then my autobiography came out in 2016. And the rest is kind of history. And I left conventional medicine not really knowing what I was going to do medically or career wise. I still don't want to make a career out of battling vaccines, but I seem to keep allowing myself to be pulled back into it, even when I think I'm living a quiet life and getting back to normal. So that's how it went.
So Dissolving Illusions was the book that turned me around from what we were taught, and I'm sure you were taught the same thing in medical school as I was. The vaccines spared the world from these terrible diseases, from smallpox to polio, and you name it, right? And you shattered that in that book. We won't have time for you could do a whole day-long lecture series on what's in that book. But the nutshell of it, maybe touch on a couple things that are just take-home messages that people, if they haven't read the book or heard you speak on this, are going to go, what? I didn't know that. Polio, for example.
Yeah, well, so what happened is Roman had already started writing the book, and he's a data guy, and he had gotten the vital statistics, as many as were available throughout the world, and looked at over time, looked at the death rates for different diseases. And sometimes some of our graphs have the disease rates, and we have to distinguish between the death rates and the disease rates. So we looked at the death rates versus the disease rate, but most importantly, he found that the death rates had already gone down an avalanche nearly to the x-axis of a graph before the vaccines came in. And to Roman, that was significant. And he started looking up historically why that might have been. And then I was kind of inching my way there on my own. And he heard me on the Gary Null radio show and contacted me, and I read his manuscript, and I thought, that's really good. I'll just write the chapter on polio, and you can call it Dissolving Illusions by Roman Bystrionic with polio chapter by Suzanne Humphries. And then the more I started to read it, the more I just kept contributing different things, because as a medical doctor, I had a different set of understanding. And so we ended up co-authoring. And it was actually Mayer Eisenstein, of all people, who said Suzanne should be the first author. When I think we could argue that maybe Roman should have been the first author, but I ended up being the first author. And that gave me all the glory, and it gave me a lot of the pain for doing that. So it was those death charts. And so we basically tell the story of what the diseases are, why the death rates were so high back then, what the evidence showed, and the fact that the gross national product really revealed a story that people still find hard to believe, which is that about 3.5% of the contribution to the decline in death rate over time for the 11 major infectious diseases had to do with the medical system, had to do with antibiotics. So when you look at gross national product, you're able to see where spending is. And so I'm not a financial person. This is something probably, Catherine Austin Fitz could answer better than me. But that was a study by McKinley and McKinley that we cite in the book, which has hundreds of references. And so it's an interesting story. And it kind of throws a bit of a wet rag on this idea that vaccines are the reason that we live longer. Vaccines are the reason why we have this wonderful society, why infant mortality went down. When, I don't know, Paul, if you've read the whole story on puerperal fever, but that was a hard one to swallow, that the death rates for puerperal fever were, in the 1700s and 1800s were, upwards were sometimes as high as 30 something percent in one Paris hospital, the death rate from puerperal fever. And I've seen some citations that were even higher, because doctors refused to believe that they could have dirty hands and that they could go into a cadaver and do a dissection and then go right in and birth a baby, where the midwife rates weren't such. And, the guys that told them to wash their hands with lime solution were ostracized just the same way that we are. So, there are just so many interesting stories that were so contrary. And so when you start understanding that, you go, oh, wow. Well, why didn't they tell us this in medical school? What difference would that have made? And then I started learning more about the vaccine paradigm and how that all began, and some of the propaganda and outright lies that were actually called out by doctors of the time for about 200 years, which is what our companion book really points out. That's my favorite part of the companion book.
Going back to smallpox, right?
Yes. So you just keep reading and just keep finding more information. And, again, my message to the public isn't don't vaccinate. My message to the public is, okay, you've already heard all that. Now listen to this. Listen to what Roman and I have dug up, and you and lots of your experience and other doctors' experiences, and you decide for yourself. Where the mainstream message is always, vaccines save lives, vaccines are safe, vaccines are effective, vaccinate your child or your child could die, or you're going to be a disease spreader. Well, I trust people to come up to their own conclusions and to be responsible for their own children, because if your kid gets hit really bad by a vaccine, guess who's going to be dealing with it? You. The government's not going to help you, except maybe if you're really lucky, really wealthy, and have good attorneys, and maybe you're a medical doctor that can sue and get millions of dollars and then have your case closed so nobody can ever use it for reference, because we know that happens. So people really need to be empowered regarding this, because it's the matter of your kid's brain and immune function for the rest of their lives.
Yes. So the graphs that were so surprising to me when I read your book were, you go from these massive deaths from vaccines to almost zero, and then the vaccines are introduced, but the same pattern for diseases for which we didn't have vaccines. And I think when I saw that, I was like, oh, wow. So it had to be something other than vaccines that caused this massive reduction in disease and death. And you outline that so beautifully: sanitation, cleaner water, living refrigeration. I mean, it was technology and engineers that really made the biggest difference. Lifestyle things.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, right. So things like cholera and, puerperal fever, and, because there were no antibiotics until the 1940s. And then you've got rheumatic fever. And, that was a big crippler. That crippled more people than polio. And as Dr. Fred Klenner talked about, nobody wanted to look at those cripples because, their legs worked. But the fact of the matter is, rheumatic fever was far more of a problem, far more numerous in terms of crippling children.
And that went away without a vaccine, right?
They had a vaccine. I believe it was a toxoid vaccine, but it caused such massive problems that just quietly removed it. We do talk about that as well. Yeah. So the critics, when they lose that battle about the death rates going down, then they go, oh, but there were still diseases, and you can take up hospital beds, and you can have side effects and adverse effects from the diseases. And yeah, that's true. There were still the diseases. We didn't eradicate measles due to sanitation. We did not eradicate mumps due to sanitation. We didn't eradicate chickenpox. But what happened was, if you look closely, the incidence rates that were reported did go down. And the question is always, do those curves go down because the diseases are so mild that parents doctors didn't even report it? I think that's a lot of it. But these are diseases that are not deadly. I still hear doctors that I respect quite a bit banging on about giving Tylenol for fevers. So when we look historically at the death rates for different diseases, or the complication rates for different diseases, we have to look at how those diseases were treated by the medical system. We have to not just look at nutrition and child labor laws, but what were the medical system doing? Like for measles, they were injecting the blood of the parents into the buttock of the child. They weren't even blood typing to do that. There was causing massive problems, not just necrosis of tissue, but immunologic problems in that sense. They were giving sedatives. We have that problem today. Lots of aspirin. That's been a problem in the past. For smallpox, they were putting people in dark rooms, bleeding them, purging them with mercury. And we talk about that in the book. So how are they treating it? That's a huge difference. And so this comes into play today. Whether you're vaccinated or not, is how the medical system is treating, I use that word very gingerly, the diseases that are presenting. And what I find when I go over the mortality, the death cases that are given to me today, is I see that nutrition is not even like the food pyramid is what they call nutrition. And so that's okay if you want to bring your child with constipation, stomach cramps, vomiting, and measles. You want to bring some chicken nuggets, some Sprite, and some French fries. That's considered great. And then they can just give you laxatives if you're constipated. There's zero nutrition in there. There's zero vitamin C. They don't give vitamin C. They don't check vitamin C levels. We know that vitamin C levels are low when patients are sick entering the hospital. We know that they drop further in hospital. So these kids basically walking around with scurvy. They don't check vitamin D levels. Something that could be really helpful is to give some vitamin D. And how do I know this? Because this is what I do to people on the outside, and they don't have to go into the hospital. And then we have the fever phobia, even amongst people, like I said, that I highly respect. Like, this has to stop. It just absolutely has to be researched and taught properly in medical school. And the other doctors need to be re-educated on the fever, because this whole idea, okay, febrile seizures. If your child has a febrile seizure, yes, that's not a good thing. And yes, that can be a problem later in life. They can continue to have febrile seizures. Is that really the only way to deal with a fever? Help me, Paul. Help me out with this, because I've got to interview you now. Is that the only way to deal with the fever, is to give Tylenol? What else could we possibly do to deal with a fever? Help me out.
First of all, I have to say, do not give Tylenol. It is probably the worst thing you can do, because it blocks the production of glutathione, and we need glutathione to fight infections, to detox. So it is going to make things worse, not better. But there are simple ways to bring a fever down. You can actually let water evaporate off your hot skin, and the fever comes right down. So a lukewarm or wet washcloth on the body, allow the water to evaporate, and the fever will come down within minutes. There's some natural things you can do, but yeah, it's not something to be feared. We actually need that fever to help fight infection. So,
Thank you. Okay. So we create heat shock proteins with that fever. We're calling in cytokines, chemokines, white blood cells that are going to do the job. Now, we don't want the fever to get out of control, but to me, the key is, let's treat the infection. Let's treat the child. And then the fever can come down on its own. Okay, can I ask you another question?
Sure.
The question is, because I've seen this several times, have you ever seen Tylenol or any, fever lowering drug given to a child with a fever, and they have the seizure when the fever comes down because it's come down too quickly?
Yeah, it's the change in the temperature that can cause the seizure. So if it goes rapidly up or rapidly down, either way, it can happen. We could have another whole discussion about what might actually be causing these, quote, febrile seizures, but that would be another whole topic.
I think it absolutely needs to be explored. Can we do that sometime? And if not today, some other time?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't realize it went way, way back, but you mentioned how it's how the medical system treats patients with infections, especially if they're not vaccinated, that might be part of the problem. We just saw this. We all went through COVID and saw that patients hospitalized with COVID were actually being mismanaged and dying because of that in massive scale. So, I mean, I had friends who were on their way to the hospital, told them stop. I knew somebody who could get them oxygen and ivermectin, and the next day they were fine. They would have been hospitalized, intubated, and dead. And we had these 2 measles cases, and I know you were involved with at least one of them, supposed death from measles. And I would, after listening to your interview that you did on this, and also to Pierre Corey's interview, it's quite clear neither of those kids in Texas died from measles. They had measles, maybe, one of them for sure, one of them maybe, but they didn't die from measles. So we still, to this date, have not had a child in the US die of measles in over a decade. Is that right?
Yeah, so here's where they'll grab any bone they can. They'll say they didn't die of measles, but if they were vaccinated and didn't get measles, they wouldn't have got the secondary infection, and then they wouldn't have died. Well, how about if they had competent doctors and parents who understood nutrition, because we had a Department of Health in the United States that actually talked about real nutrition, and doctors that knew how to treat an immune system rather than dealing with diseases as they see them and only prevention. And like pretty much everything they did was just upside down, inside out, and backwards. It was an appalling experience for me to read through that chart.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the huge effort you put into it, because I think it's important that we set the record straight, because the media will forevermore talk about those 2 deaths, whereas those of us who know better know that it wasn't measles that killed those kids. We've run out of time. I'm going to have to get you back because there are so many things I want to talk to you about. But before we leave, I was wondering if you could share with our viewers where they can get your information. You mentioned a website. You mentioned somewhere where you have some of your written documents. What's the best way to get your information? You have so much good information.
If you just want to do the easiest thing, just go to dissolvingillusions.com, because that has pretty much everything where you can reach Roman and myself, and all of the links to our other websites. But my personal website is drsuzanne.net. And then there's my Odyssey channel, where I had to move all of my videos off of YouTube when they canceled me. I always spell it wrong, but it's odyssey.com. It's a video specialty service, and the CEO wrote to me and thanked me for using it. So I assume that I'm safe there for now. And then finally, there's X, and my X handle is DRSUZANNEH7. And Joe Rogan built my audience back for me. So go there, because that's where I do all of my posting.
Fantastic. Well, since you brought up Joe Rogan, and I was so intrigued that you were able to, masterful interview, by the way, I watched the whole thing. Did you get pushback at all from that? I know you've had pushback from a lot of things.
You want to get into that now?
I guess
it's a whole conversation, because the answer is yes, I have had.
Well, I want to thank you for being willing to stick your neck out for our world. I mean, for our kids, for society, at great cost to you personally. So thank you very much. So folks, you can find me at kidsfirstforever.com. I look forward to seeing you next week. We're going to have Dr. Suzanne Humphries back in the very near future.
So can you tell us your name, please?
My name is Barbara Little.
And this is about your dad?
It is.
Okay, so let's go right back to why, because he took some Moderna shots. Why did you think that was a good idea?
Well, he didn't actually think it was a good idea, but his doctor, all of his friends, and one of his daughters, my sister, coerced him. I had sent him a lot of information about what was going on, and he said, no, I'm not going to take it. But then he wanted to go to my grandniece, his great-granddaughter's first communion. And my sister said he couldn't come unless he got the shot. So he did.
All right, and this is Moderna.
Yep.
And he had, we think, quite a few, we're not sure.
He had at least the first 2. He had the first one, had 2 heart attacks in fairly quick succession. Not terribly serious heart attacks, and he survived those. Got the second one, had 2 more heart attacks, and then a stroke, and survived all of that. So much so that he would say to people afterwards, I don't think I could have had heart attacks. Who survives 4 heart attacks and a stroke? And I would say a really, really strong man who was suffering from the effects of the shots.
Okay, we have to go back a second because something's very wrong here.
Yeah.
He takes a Moderna shot.
Yeah.
Then he has 2 heart attacks.
Right.
And then, is it his doctor?
His cardiologist wanted him to get shots.
So even though he'd had 2 heart attacks
Right.
after the first Moderna,
Right.
it was advised for him to have another.
Well, yeah, because he collapsed. They were not serious heart attacks. I'm guessing probably myocarditis because he came out of an elevator and collapsed. He collapsed again at a meeting that he went to and got caught. He didn't hit the ground really hard, and it was in the first year when everyone was denying there was any correlation between heart problems and the shots. And he had a problem in his carotid artery 40 years ago and had been on statins. So when he had the heart attack, all the cardiologist did was give him more statins.
Right, okay, it's disturbing to hear
Yes.
this. So then, okay, so he has 1 Moderna, 2 heart attacks, has another Moderna, and has another 2 heart attacks.
And a stroke then.
And then a stroke on top of that.
Right.
And at that point, is he realizing that it's a shot? Is anybody outside of you realizing that
My baby sister did. That we were the only 2, and nobody wanted to hear anything about it from us.
So after the 2 other heart attacks, were they bigger than the first 2 heart attacks?
No, they were fairly mild as well.
As if that's okay. And then...
But he was a really, really strong guy. He had been a boxer in his youth, and he was one of those that really, he didn't take fantastic care of himself. He didn't eat all the right things and all that, but he just was in really good health.
Okay, and now what happened after the stroke? How was his health after that?
He started to decline a lot.
Do you know if he got any more vaccinations of any kind after that?
I don't think he did. I did tell him I thought his heart attacks were connected to the shots, and I asked him, please don't get a flu shot or anything else, and he did not.
Okay. So who was looking after him after the stroke?
He lived on his own.
Okay.
My husband and I went to him. I just could see him declining. I could hear, I would call him all the time. I'd FaceTime because he lived in Florida. And I could tell he was declining. What I didn't realize was how much weight he was losing. I mean, he probably lost 50, 60 pounds, and he didn't need to lose it. He could have lost 20 pounds and been good, but he was a shadow of himself when he died. His legs kept collapsing out from under him, and he just got so weak he couldn't care for himself. We got a caregiver. He refused to go to live with any of us. He refused to go into a nursing home. And he was 87 when he got the first shot. And, well, all of them, I guess. And then it just 2 years of absolute decline.
What was written on his death certificate? What was his cause of death?
Natural causes.
Just natural. So everything was just as it
Yeah.
was meant to be.
Yep.
Wow.
And he was under hospice care. I got hospice to help out and took him off all his medications because he was taking quite a few of them. And that was one of the things that was really difficult for him. My mother had died 4.5 years before, and he was really, really missing her. And he was on all these medications because he had had a stroke while she was dying. Again, he recovered fine from that. And so he had all of these reasons not to get the jabs, but everybody
Now,
was
did you
there.
take the jab?
No.
And did you get COVID?
I think I just had it last couple of weeks ago. I didn't get it for years and years, but and I don't know if I had it because I'm not going to get tested.
Right.
It's a coronavirus.
Right. Now, but my point of this is, do you have any of the conditions you'll die? Have you had any heart attacks,
No.
strokes?
Nope.
Or do you have myocarditis?
Nope.
Do you have anything at all related?
I'm completely healthy. I haven't had any, the biggest thing was, it was just a couple of weeks ago, I was, had this long 3 weeks worth of coughing, headaches, fatigue.
So flu-like symptoms.
Yeah, pretty much.
Says a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add to the story? Okay, Daddy.
You know, I know he was lonely and he was missing my mom, but I think really, other than the shots, what really caused him to die was he was a really big extrovert. And he had a huge community that he was involved with, which is why he wouldn't come live with me, because he'd lose all that. But, you know, they shut down the churches. They shut down. He was a member of AA, and he was at meetings 3 or 4 times a week. They shut all that down. Did it on Zoom. He hated that. And they finally, you know, his church started meeting again. He was so isolated and so bereaved. Still, my mom had died a year before all of this started. So he was just coming out of his first year of bereavement when they shut everything down. And my younger sister and I took him to California after things finally opened up again. He called it his farewell tour. And he'd already lost some weight. He'd lost the initial weight and was weak. But another year and he was gone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Me too. He was a good guy.
Thank you for telling the story.
Autism destroys families. More importantly, it destroys our greatest resource, which are our children.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
pledged to find out what is driving the country's rise in autism.
Compiling medical records from a number of databases. He'll direct resources to study environmental factors, exposures, and external factors.
Scientific progress on this has been slow because scientists are frankly scared to ask the question.
Genes don't cause epidemics. You need an environmental toxin, and we're going to look at all the potential culprits.
With no a priori thumb on the scale, you can't look at that.
Yeah. I'm very grateful to the Secretary for finally saying from an important public platform that this is an epidemic and we need to find the causes and we need to stop it.
Other issues DHE has been pushing for years are finally gaining mainstream traction.
Today we're announcing we are removing industry members, pharma members from FDA advisory committees.
We're seeing reports that you're considering removing the COVID vaccine as a mandatory shot for children.
The recommendation for children was always dubious. The vaccine itself does have profound risk of myocarditis, pericarditis, even strokes.
Very, 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 very few people are still taking these things. In that sense, the mRNA vaccines for COVID in the marketplace are effectively dead.
We are working together to change the federal fluoride recommendations, and we're looking at the science now. There's a direct inverse correlation between fluoride exposure and low IQ in children.
Health officials announced plans to phase out 8 artificial dyes from our food supply.
The FDA is effectively removing all petroleum-based food dyes from the U.S. food supply.
We don't have a surveillance system that actually works, and that is a crime. And we will do that right away. And I understand the perverse incentives that need to be changed right away.
When there's a political will to answer a question like this, it will happen.
We're going to change things for real this time.